Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another online event organized under our analytical program, Russian Disinformation in Visegrad Group countries. The program is supported by the Visegrad Fund, and today we will touch the topic of Polish perspective over the years when it comes to the main topic, which is Russian disinformation towards the country of Poland. My pleasure to introduce my today's expert. Today with me, Mikołaj Rogalewicz. Good evening, Mikołaj.
Good evening.
Thank you very much for joining. We'll start with coming back to past a little bit. I want to ask you about the strategies and methods of disinformation that Russia employed against Poland prior to its invasion on Ukraine. And after that, if you could just complement your answer on how did the invasion alter or escalate these tactics. The floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. Answering your question, we have to say that Russia has been using this information as a foreign policy tool for many years against various countries. And Poland is one of those countries against which disinformation activities are conducted on a massive scale. Before the war broke out in Ukraine, Russia used various disinformation narratives in different areas. Significantly, the main channel for spreading disinformation in Poland is social media, especially Facebook and Twitter, where Russia, using often fake accounts, including bots and trolls, spreads pro-Kremlin narratives. Another channel used by Russia before the outbreak of war was various news portals such as Sputnik, RT, and various typically Polish portals such as Niezależny Dziennik Polityczny, which was, by the way, conducted by Russian special services. There were also a lot of such portals, and they often duplicated the same narrative, the same false information, in order to increase the credibility of a given piece of information, so as to show that the different portals were writing about it. What appeared on these portals was usually further spread through various social media accounts, but after outbreak of war in Ukraine in 2022, the EU banned these various pro-Russian portals. Poland even took broader action and removed many other pro-Russian websites. So now these disinformation narratives go mainly through social media. If we talk about specific methods, because the question is also about the methods Russia uses, the first basic method is multi-vector narratives on specific topics that are repeatedly, systematically spread. And an important feature of Russian disinformation is continuity, which means that a given disinformation narrative is shared systematically in different forms. The second method is short messages, which often deliver information emotionally, usually without citing the source. And these messages are designed to trigger a certain reaction and distort the audience's perception of events. The third method is false or manipulated article title, so that this title does not correspond with the text. This method assumes that most of the audience will not read the whole article and will only acquire information from a catchy headline that simply misleads. A good field for manipulation using this method is social media, where users in an information overload simply do not have time to read the entire text and often pay attention only to the title of the shared article. Another method is to use old quotes as a new information and therefore cite words in an improper context for propaganda purposes. A similar method is using fake quotes, that is, attributing words to someone that he or she simply never said. A popular method of deception used by Russia is also the spread of conspiracy theories, but also hiding facts, facts that are not favorable to Russia. A clear example of the use of this method is in the past was USSR's denial of the Katyn massacre for many years. And the last method, which is also very popular, is the publication of fake interviews, involving the complete fabrication of the interview, including the person being interviewed. So the interview is then published in written form, and the person is presented as an expert or a resident of an area, but in reality, such person does not exist. The first method is multi-vector narratives, and they cover different eras. And maybe let's give some examples of such narratives. The first key era was Polish-Ukrainian relations, and disinformation targeting Polish-Ukrainian relations has been going on for a long time, not only until early 2022, because Poland was one of those countries that supported Ukraine in its pro-European aspirations. And those Russia's disinformation operations focused on generating antagonism between those two nations and creating some kind of atmosphere of conflict by building, for instance, a fascist image of Ukraine in the perception of Polish society and creating some kind of sense of threat from that country in Poles. But on the other hand, activities were carried out to arouse in Ukrainians the feeling that they cannot count on Poland to realize their European aspirations. Another narrative was about creating a negative image of Poland in the international relations. Very important goal was also to create a sense of threat to Russia and its society from Poland and its allies. A lot of narratives, anti-EU and anti-NATO narratives, undermining trust in both organizations in Polish society. We had also a lot of energetic narratives, which were promoting gas and oil supplies from Russia, but also discrediting supplies of these resources from other sources. And the last era in which we had a lot of false information, Russian disinformation, this is COVID-19 pandemic. Here we had a lot of narratives aimed at creating some confusion and fear in the Polish society, where we had also narratives which were promoting the Russian vaccine and discrediting other countries' vaccines. And it is also worth mentioning that Russian disinformation is directed at different target groups and has different objectives for each. If we are talking about disinformation targeting Poland, those disinformation campaigns are not only aimed at Polish society, but also Western societies, Ukrainian society, and Russian society. So those are those main groups which are targeted by Russian disinformation. And you also asked how did the invasion escalate these tactics used by Russia. So basically the outbreak of war in Ukraine led to a huge increase in disinformation activities targeting Poland, especially in the context of war in Ukraine and in the context of refugees from Ukraine. This was also related to the fact that Poland has helped Ukraine to a huge extent and has also taken many refugees from Ukraine. Poland also supported Ukraine in the EU and NATO. So Poland is for Russia one of the main targets if we are talking about disinformation.
Thank you very much. Many methods, many ways of disinformation targeted against Poland. We had all quotes used as new quotes, fake quotes, troll social media accounts, news portals, even Polish news portals. So in fact, many methods and tools used by Russia against Poland. You've mentioned a lot about Ukraine. We spoke a little bit about Russian invasion against Ukraine. Now let's move to nearest the current times and the nearest future. I'd like to ask you, how has the Russian disinformation evolved when it comes to targeting Poland after the invasion? You said a little bit about it in your previous response, and to what extent has the border crisis with Belarus and the Ukrainian refugee influx been exploited as a disinformation tools by Russian Federation?
Well, so after the outbreak of war in Ukraine, Russia used various types of disinformation narratives. Some of them directed at the Polish public were effective, some of them were not effective. Uh, In the initial phase of war, one of the narratives was to deny the crimes Russia was committing. So narratives were spread that Russia was not attacking civilian objects or civilians, but only military facilities, and that its goal was to overthrow the Nazi government in Ukraine. In fact, Russian troops, obviously, already at the beginning of the war, in addition to bombing military facilities, airfields, and other vital infrastructure, also attacked residential buildings, schools, kindergartens, hospitals, and committed crimes against civilians on a huge scale. There were also many narratives justifying Russian actions, initially not even calling it a war, but a special military operation. And we had such narratives like Russia had to carry out the operation in order to defend Russian civilians, like biological weapons were being developed in Ukraine, Nazis are in government in Ukraine, and so on and so on. So blaming Ukraine for this war. What's also interesting, a significant event around which a lot of false information appeared was the Bucha massacre, perpetrated by the Russians. When the crimes were revealed, Russian portals argued that footage from Bucha showing dead bodies in the streets had been simply faked by Ukrainians. Another disinformation narratives about the Bucha events assumed that it was a psychological operation carried out by Great Britain. In reality, the Bucha massacre was carried out by Russian soldiers during the occupation of that town. At the time, they murdered over 400 civilians. This has been confirmed by different sources like Bellingcat, the Atlantic Council, BBC, and different other sources. Well, regarding the Bucha crime, Russian propaganda centers used the method of denying facts and blaming Ukraine. This is a disinformation method characteristic of the Russians. A clear example of it is also the statement of Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who in March 2022, after a meeting with Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmitry Kuleba, answered one of the journalist's questions and said that Russia had not invaded Ukraine and was not planning to invade other countries. So this is the practical use of this method, which is called denying facts. But, those Russian narratives of accusing Ukraine of starting war and narratives whitewashing Russia were not effective in Poland. We had a lot of such narratives, but Polish society simply didn't believe that. But unfortunately, we also had a lot of narratives that were effective in influencing Polish society. We need to remember that Russian aggression led to a mass refugee exodus of Ukrainians from threatened territories. A significant number of Ukrainian refugees ended up in Poland, and Polish authorities and society showed exceptional commitment to helping those in need. But at the same time, since the beginning of the war, Russia propaganda centers have been spreading false information about Ukrainian refugees in Polish society, with the aim of stoking fear and creating some kind of a negative attitude among Poles towards Ukrainians, but also discouraging Poles from providing support to the invaded Ukraine. At the beginning of war, when the first wave of refugees began to arrive in Poland, Russia carried out a disinformation campaign that people of dark skin color were coming from Ukraine to attack Polish women and children, and false information was passed on that there were crimes such as assaults and rapes in and around Przemyśl, which is a small city in Poland, on the border with Ukraine, and some kind of a feeling of danger was created and calls for defense were made. And in this way, efforts were made up to stir up some hatred and question the acceptance of people coming from Ukraine. To spread disinformation targeting refugees from Ukraine, Russia also used the murder of a young man that occurred in Warsaw in May 2022 on one of the most popular streets in Warsaw, on Nowy Świat. At the same time, false information was massively circulated on the internet that the murder was carried out by Ukrainians. In addition, it was suggested that Ukrainians were responsible for most crimes in Poland. There were also materials from years ago showing acts of violence that were shown falsely as crimes committed by Ukrainians. So these actions were aimed at arousing antagonism between Poles and Ukrainians, and unfortunately, those kind of disinformation narratives were effective to some extent. Another event that was used by Russia for disinformation purposes was the migration crisis on the border with Belarus. And first of all, Russia used this crisis to polarize and divide Polish society. In addition, narratives were spread about Poland as a state that violates human rights, and Russia obviously blamed Poland for this crisis. So those were the main narratives which were used by Russia after the outbreak of war. Some of them were effective, some of them were not, especially the narratives which are effective were narratives aimed at Ukrainian refugees and aimed at creating some chaos and the atmosphere of fear in Russian society, in Polish society.
Thank you very much. As you said, the main areas in which Russia acted after the invasion of Ukraine were denying the crimes, the justification of actions as a special military operation, the term that is widely known after the invasion of Ukraine, and of course blaming Ukraine on all of the actions committed. Same what you said about border crisis with Belarus or Ukraine refugee influx after the war. Now let's move more to the Polish internal politics, internal situation. Last year we had parliamentary elections. Next year we are having presidential elections in Poland. I would like to ask you whether there was any Russian disinformation for previous elections or even more in past. Was there any impact from Russia's side, any actions targeted towards elections, towards electoral processes, or any social media campaigns? What's your opinion on that?
We unfortunately had a lot of disinformation narratives about the elections. Disinformation as a political tool, which is used by Russia, is used for various purposes, and influencing democratic processes in other countries is one of their main goals. So, this is the case with regard to various countries, not just Poland. Russia uses disinformation and tries to influence elections in different countries, United States, Slovakia, different EU countries, but also in Poland. And there have been many such examples in recent years. In the case of the recent European Parliament elections, we had a lot of different disinformation narratives discouraging people from voting. So these narratives were aimed at lowering turnout. They portrayed the EU and in a bad light, undermined trust in democratic processes, but also EU institutions. And according to these narratives, Poland's membership in the EU is not worth it. Russia obviously seeks to split the EU from the insides and also supports groups that are against the EU. In this way, looking at the long term, its goal is to get more countries to leave the EU, to make the EU fall apart. Here we can remind that there was a great amount of disinformation in 2016 about Brexit. Russia obviously supported Brexit. The next example is for the 2023 parliamentary elections in Poland. Russia used narrative suggesting that the elections are not democratic, undermined trust in the elections, in the public institutions, obviously were discouraging people from voting, showing that the democracy is weak. This is also the goal of Russia, to show the weakness of democracy. And there were also various narratives used to polarize society and create some chaos and confusion. Another example, the presidential election during 2020, and we had various narratives that the election was falsified. We also can remind that in 2020 we had many protests in Poland over the tightening of abortion law, and Russia used those events and used narratives that these protests were against the falsified elections in Poland. So, but in 2020 we also had the presidential elections in Belarus, and officially Lukashenko won, but there were many claims that these elections were not fair, there were a lot of voter fraud, and Belarusians organized mass protest against these elections. And Russia then used narratives that it was Poland and the West that were trying to influence the elections in Belarus, and that they were supporting the protest because they wanted to carry out a coup, and in fact that in Poland there were falsified elections. So those kind of narratives were also used. So as we can see, Russian narratives are about elections in Poland or different countries, but Russia also uses narratives about elections in Russia or in Belarus to argue that these elections are fair. In the case of Poland, we usually deal with such narratives as during elections, as discouragement of voting, undermining trust in public institutions and democratic processes, narratives which are aimed at showing that elections were falsified. But in different countries, for instance, in Slovakia in 2023, Russia also used disinformation to influence the result of the elections. They officially supported Fico's parties, and Russia's goal was to influence the outcome of those elections and bring the pro-Russian Smer party to power. So we can see that Russia uses those disinformation narratives about election in different countries and can have different goals if we are talking about those different countries.
Thank you very much, Mikołaj. Let me just underline a few of the outcomes after your response. So first of all, the main goal of Russia is to influence democratic processes in other countries. For example, when it comes to electoral processes, to discourage people from voting. But you've given a good point here that it's not only about influencing the foreign electoral processes, but also disinformation related to internal voting processes in Russia and Belarus. Uh, let's stick to Poland reacting to Russia disinformation. I would like to ask you about some kind of assessment on how effectively throughout the years Poland, including the government, civil society, media, etc., is countering Russian disinformation campaigns. How good are we in that? How much of a progress we've made? And are there any innovative methods of countering disinformation? How would you see that?
Well, so I would say that as for the fight against disinformation in Poland, it is not bad, but it could be much better. As for the government's actions, first of all, it is very important to respond quickly to disinformation campaigns. When we had the initial phase of war in Ukraine and Russia carried out disinformation campaigns with regard to Przemysl, for instance, it was the Polish governmental agency that sent out SMS messages that this information was false to people who lived in that region. So that was the quick reaction. Let's also remember that many pro-Russian portals in Poland were removed after the outbreak of war in 2022. So this also reduced the possibilities of disinformation. That was also effective. That was because of the EU, but Poland also removed many other pro-Russian portals which were not removed by the EU decision. On the other hand, a lot of false information is spread through social media, and here NGOs play a big role. For instance, there is a such program on Facebook in which Facebook cooperates with fact-checking organizations. They debunk the fake news that appear on this platform. They write an article on why a particular piece of information is false, and then mark particular posts on Facebook that spread this information. So that way, when someone sees a post with a particular false information, they will immediately see that it is fake news. And in addition, portals spreading this information are less likely to be displayed to users. Regarding the society, it is very important not to share false information. Here, I believe that there is a need for activities aimed at increasing people's awareness of this information. It is necessary to maintain critical thinking and not to share information if we are not sure that it is true. As far as innovative methods are concerned, I think more focus should be placed on preemptive measures. These involve predicting in some way what narratives may appear and informing the public about it before they appear. To the same, information campaigns can be carried out with information about what kind of fake news might appear. If, for example, we have a presidential election in Poland next year, we can carry out an information campaign in which we will inform society what kind of false information can appear. So in this way, we can immune the Polish society. So I think that Poland is taking good measures to combat disinformation, and it is effective to some extent, but Russia uses this information constantly. So we need to be ready to fight next disinformation campaigns.
Thank you very much. So we still have a lot of place to improve, but in fact, we are doing pretty well, as you've said. And it's really good to hear that there is a crucial role of NGOs, fact-checking NGOs in this process of debunking Russian disinformation. And of course, your last part of the response that we need to predict and build this immunity for future, for example, elections and future Russian disinformation actions towards Poland. I have a last question for today. From today's perspective, what would you say are the most pressing challenges that Poland is facing in terms of Russian disinformation?
Well, so I would say that the immediate challenges of Russian disinformation that Poland will have to face in the nearest future are, first of all, further disinformation narratives regarding Ukraine, narratives related to the potential end of war in Ukraine. Secondly, disinformation about the upcoming presidential elections in Poland. There will be definitely a lot of disinformation on this topic. In addition, further narratives aimed at polarizing society, introducing chaos and an atmosphere of fear. As for the actions that should be taken, in my view, to combat these threats, I would say that firstly, what is very important, responding quickly to disinformation campaigns by the government. Quickly debunk such information, for instance, through a social media message, communicate, or by sending information directly to the citizens, as we had it during this information campaign regarding Przemyśl. The second action, education and information activities to raise citizens' awareness of the dangers of disinformation. Perhaps there is a field for cooperation between the government and the NGOs here. Perhaps introducing the subject of media literacy into schools would be also a good solution. And the last action which can be taken, on a wider scale, in my view, is preemptive measures. That what I said. I mean, anticipating false information and informing citizens about it in advance to immune the citizens and show them before what kind of disinformation can appear.
Thank you very much. So basically, the burning topics that we shall expect in the future are still Ukraine, upcoming presidential elections, and of course, current polarization of society. And very nice idea at the end you've given to our viewers that we shall introduce something like media literacy programs to schools so that we can share awareness from the young age with people and prepare them for the potentially upcoming challenges, manipulations, and disinformation within the social media. That was the last question for today. Thank you very much, Mikołaj, for participation and sharing your interesting views and insights with our viewers. And dear viewers, thank you for being with us today. And I highly encourage you to participate tomorrow, where we will speak about Visegrad Group perspective on Russian disinformation with bigger focus on Slovakia, Hungary, and Czech Republic. Once again, thank you very much and have a nice evening.
Thank you very much.